let me briefly explain why I started researching 9/11. That day I was baffled and offended at the instant war drumbeat and the quick certainty in targeting the enemy, Osama bin Laden, within minutes. It smelled fishy from the start, but in the coming years there were major problems with the official story which forced me to keep researching this. Physics, my personal favorite of the hard sciences. In New York that day, 2 planes hit 2 buildings, and 3 buildings collapsed. Yes, 3 buildings collapsed that day. Have you heard of World Trade Center 7, the 3rd building which collapsed later that day on 9/11? If not, please Google WTC 7 after this episode. All 3 of these buildings collapsed at nearly free fall speed in 10 to 15 seconds into their respective footprints. This means that the tops of the World Trade Center buildings fell nearly as fast as they would have if only air was beneath them, or a vacuum. But in a world where the basic laws of physics apply, quantum physics miracles aside, all of that steel and concrete below the tops of those buildings should have offered tons of resistance. I finally brought this simple science experiment to perform for people at this month's street action on the 11th in San Francisco. According to all video and seismic records, the tops of the buildings in fact managed to fall through the path of most resistance, through the entire building below, instead of falling off to the sides of the buildings, which would have offered no resistance. Furthermore, if Al-Qaeda really wanted to inflict maximum damage and death on the people of New York City, it would have been infinitely easier to make the building topple over to the side, rather than imploding it completely into its own footprint. It takes a highly scientific controlled demolition team, usually days, to set up for a collapse of a building that large, specifically so they can make it fall into its own footprint. So according to the 9/11 Commission report, it seems like controlled demolition companies should just be thinking about using airplanes in the future to collapse buildings into their own footprint, instead of wasting all this time planning. World Trade Centers 1, 2, and 7 were also the first 3 and the last 3 large steel buildings to collapse from fire and damage in history. Now, despite my loving physics for most of my life, I majored in computer science with a minor in mathematics, and you shouldn't take my word alone for anything. So here's Stephen Jones.
My name is Dr. Stephen Jones. I have a PhD in physics from Vanderbilt University, 1978. I have a Bachelor of Science degree from Brigham Young University, 1973. I graduated magna cum laude. I went after PhD work. I did postdoctoral work at Los Alamos Maison Physics Facility. In June 2007, I was examining a dust sample, which I'd obtained from Jeanette McKinley. I was using a loupe and also just looking at it with my eyes and an ordinary optical microscope, although stereo, so that I could see better in 3 dimensions. And what I found was a chip that looked like it might be a paint chip. I mean, early on I was thinking maybe not too interesting, but this chip was rather striking in its appearance. It had an orange-red color, first of all, and then I found several of these, and they all had some gray material adhering to the side of the red material. So layered. Later we found multiple layers, but most of these chips have 2 layers, red, gray. I did take one of these chips then to the electron microscope, the scanning electron microscope, and we looked at it with the electron microscope, and then we used a system where we could determine the elements. What we found in the red material is a combination of aluminum and iron oxide, and these are the components of thermite. Of course, now we looked with an electron microscope, we looked deeper and deeper, a higher and higher magnification. And I pulled in a colleague of mine, Dr. Jeffrey Ferrer. He's an expert on the electron microscope machine. So he actually broke a piece off of one of these red chips, and then later he did 4 different samples, broke a piece off. That gives you a fresh surface. Because in the dust, there's all sorts of stuff. There's zinc and titanium and calcium, all sorts of stuff. So he broke off a tip, you see, so we could look at a fresh surface. And then what you see in all 4 samples that we studied in this detail: carbon, which is significant, oxygen, iron, and aluminum. We looked at this, and these again are the ingredients, except for the carbon, and we found that experimenters working with superthermite, trying to beef it up, make it more explosive, tailoring it to different weapons applications, they would have silicon in there and an organic material, which means a carbon. So a polymer such as Viton, they would add to this to give it the properties they wanted. So that fit. Now, see, that was surprising to me to see silicon and carbon, but then we find in the literature that's what these guys are doing in the weapons labs, Livermore and Los Alamos. They're adding organic, because that gives you a gas production. When the thermite goes off, now you also have gas production, which gives you the explosive force, for instance. I suggested that we take a sample of this red-gray chip material and run it through a very sensitive instrument called a differential scanning calorimeter. And he did that. What it does, you heat the temperature slowly, and the material will react if it's going to. And if it reacts and produces heat, you'll get a spike in your calorimeter. And then if it reacts quickly, it'll be a narrow spike. If it, say, burns over a long period of time, you'll see a big broad spike. And the total area there is the total amount of energy released, and it gives you a lot of information. What we found, what Dr. Farrer found first, and he was real excited when he told me about this, he took one of these chips and he put it in the differential scanning calorimeter, and sure enough, it went off at right about 430 centigrade, but more importantly, the peak was high, which means a lot of energy released, and narrow, which means, in his terms, it blew up. You know, you say, man, this is it. This stuff blows up. It behaves just like it has the ingredients of nanothermite. He said, well, there should be, in a thermite reaction, you should produce molten iron. So you should see some spheres of iron. Think of spraying water in the air, and you get droplets that are more or less spherical because the surface tension pulls the liquid into a sphere. It's very simple. Same thing with molten iron from the thermitic reaction, whether it's ordinary conventional thermite or this super nanothermite. Either way, you get this molten iron, and you should get these droplets of iron. So we said we got to look for those. You know, if you don't find those, maybe who knows what it is, but we got to find droplets of molten iron. Otherwise, we're not sure we had the thermite reaction, the thermitic reaction. In this case, it's a nanothermite. So we looked, and wow, what a beautiful sight. As you look at this, after the red material is reacted, there are these little spheres, just tons of them. And we compared the traces that we got in this sophisticated calorimeter with traces obtained with known thermite. These are published data, and our peak is actually narrower. I mean, this stuff goes off with very rapidly, and more energy also than had been reported by these other researchers working with known nanothermite.
I used to go to the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, yearly for science competitions, and that building and organization was like one of my heroes growing up. But here I feel this same organization has been now lying to me right to my face about the very laws of physics they helped instill in me 15 years ago. NIST is in charge of standards for hardcore things like how much 1 gram weighs. How could its leadership betray such logic and trust for this cause? Under pressure from the Bush administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, told the brave first responders that they did not need masks to protect themselves from the very toxic dust, and those most inspiring humans have kept painfully dying ever since. In August of 2003, the EPA published a report saying, quote, "The White House Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ, influenced through the collaboration process the information that EPA communicated to the public through its early press releases when it convinced EPA to add reassuring statements and delete cautionary ones." End quote. New York Daily News recently reported that Paula Rodriguez, 44, a New York Fire Department emergency medical technician, died May 30th of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, pushing for important legislation for the needed care for these first responders and their families. It says she is one of the 900 related first responder deaths, but as New York Democrat Carolyn Maloney explains, thousands of first responders and survivors have serious illnesses that will require medical care for life, and our bill will ensure that they get the care they need. End quote. Someday more American first responders will have died from 9/11 than the 3,000 victims taken from us on that day. Just in the last month, this issue has made it to Congress again, and I encourage all of my listeners to check out the recent inspiring clip of Congressman Anthony Weiner defending this bill to improve aid for 9/11 first responders. In the weeks after the tragic event, CBS and the San Francisco Chronicle, among others, reported on the millions made in the stock market on that day. There was a notably high number of put options, bets that a stock's price would fall on American Airlines and United Airlines, the two airlines affected or hijacked on 9/11. Despite plenty of solid leads for major red flags and prior knowledge to 9/11, the final 9/11 Commission report contained this infamous and offensive statement. Quote, "To date, the U.S. government has not been able to determine the origin of the money used for the 9/11 attacks. Ultimately, the question is of little practical significance." End quote, Chapter 5.